The bell above the gun store door jingled with a tired metallic ring, the kind that echoed too long in the quiet of a small Montana town. It was late afternoon, that lazy hour when sunlight slanted low through dusty windows, and the only sounds came from the ceiling fan humming above, and the soft creak of old wood under tired boots. Every eye in the store turned when the door opened. An old man stepped in, slow and deliberate, his hand resting lightly on a wooden cane that looked as worn as he did. His coat hung loose on his thin frame, frayed at the cuffs, the faded brown fabric whispering against itself as he walked. The kind of coat that had seen more winters than most of the men inside. His hat, a sun-bleached fedora, cast a shadow that nearly covered his face, but not quite. You could still see his eyes, pale blue, sharp, searching. Eyes that didn't quite belong to someone his age. 3 young men lounging near the counter looked up from where they sat flipping through a hunting magazine. The tallest one, Jake Turner, barely 23, nudged his buddy, smirking. "Check out Grandpa," he whispered. "Looks like he got lost on his way to the antique shop." The others chuckled quietly, their laughter bouncing off the wooden walls, breaking the stillness of the afternoon. Walter Ahn, though no one yet knew his name, didn't even glance at them. He walked with a certain rhythm, each step measured. He paused near a rack of rifles, his hand hovering just above a Winchester lever action model, the kind favored by hunters from another era. His fingers didn't shake, not really, though his skin looked paper-thin and pale. He ran his thumb along the rifle's polished stock, the motion slow and reverent, like a priest handling a relic. Behind the counter, the young clerk, also named Jake, the same who'd laughed first, leaned forward on his elbows. "Can I help you with something, sir?" he asked, his tone polite, but edged with that unmistakable air of condescension young men often reserved for the elderly. "Looking for a souvenir? Something light maybe, for the collection?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took his time, as if considering the words carefully. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "I'm looking for a Colt 1911, preferably the original model, not one of those new replicas." The laughter started again, quick and stifled. "A Colt?" One of the boys near the back repeated. "What's he gonna do? Scare the squirrels?" Walter turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He looked at the young man who'd spoken, not with anger, not even irritation, but with something colder. A quiet kind of knowing that made the laughter falter. Jake cleared his throat. "Well, sir, we might have one of those in stock. Haven't had anyone ask for that in a while, though." He reached into the display case and lifted a sleek, black handgun onto the counter. "Classic piece," he said with a smirk. "You sure you can handle it?" Walter's eyes drifted over the weapon. "It'll do," he said simply. When he picked it up, the boys noticed something. The tremor they expected in his hands, the telltale shake of age, wasn't there. His fingers closed around the grip with familiarity, his thumb brushing against the safety like it was muscle memory. He raised it, aimed gently at the floor, and let out a small breath. The sound of the store seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by silence. "Still balanced," he murmured quietly, almost to himself. The laughter stopped. Jake watched, uneasy now. Yeah. It's a fine weapon," he said, his earlier tone gone. "You, looking for ammo too?" ".45 caliber rounds," Walter replied. Jake nodded quickly, turning to the shelf behind him. Right. We've got a few boxes of those." As Jake packed the box and rang up the purchase, the old man reached into his coat and pulled out a thin, worn leather wallet. He didn't fumble or squint at the card reader, just signed the receipt in one fluid motion. His penmanship was crisp, deliberate, every letter formed with the care of someone trained to make their mark count. Jake glanced down at the signature. For a second, he didn't react. Then his brow furrowed. He looked again, his voice catching slightly. Major, Walter N., U.S. Army? Retired? Walter slid his wallet back into his pocket, his expression neutral. That's right. The name echoed in Jake's head. It was familiar, too familiar. He didn't know from where, but it carried weight. He'd heard it somewhere, maybe at the Veterans Hall, or in one of those local papers framed by the door. The air in the store changed subtly. The laughter that had hung in the room moments before, replaced by something quieter, heavier. One of the young men, still leaning near the rifle rack, gave an awkward chuckle. Major, huh? Like in the military? He said, his voice thinner now. Walter didn't answer. He picked up the small box of ammunition, slipped it into his coat pocket, and nodded politely at the clerk. Thank you for your help. Jake just stood there, watching as the old man turned and made his way to the door. The sound of his boots against the wooden floor was the only thing that broke the silence. When the bell above the door jingled again, it seemed louder than before. The old man stepped outside into the fading sunlight, the shadows of the mountains stretching long across Main Street. He paused for a moment, looking down the road. Across the street, the town's small bank sat quiet and still, a single flag fluttering lazily in the breeze. Walter adjusted his hat and walked on, his figure slowly swallowed by the glow of the setting sun. Back inside the store, the silence stretched uncomfortably. One of the young men finally spoke, trying to sound casual. What's the big deal? He's just some old vet. Probably barely remembers which end of the gun to use. The store owner, Harold, a man in his 60s who had been in the back room the whole time, stepped out then, wiping his hands on a rag. What's that you said? His tone was calm, but sharp enough to cut through the still air. The boy shifted uneasily. Just saying? He seemed kinda... Don't, Harold interrupted. He looked down at the receipt on the counter and froze. You boys don't know who that was, do you? Jake blinked. No, sir. Harold stared at the name for a long moment, then looked up, his face pale. That man saved my brother's life, he said quietly. Vietnam. He was a sniper. Got pinned down in a jungle for 2 days, surrounded by enemy fire. Walter Ahn picked off 16 targets, one at a time, and got the whole platoon out alive. The room went still. No one spoke. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to fade into the background. Jake swallowed hard. The receipt in his hand suddenly felt heavy, almost sacred. The same name that had been a joke moments ago now carried the weight of something unspoken. Sacrifice, courage, history. Outside, through the dusty window, they could still see him, just a small figure moving slowly down the street. The same man they had laughed at. The same man who had once stood between life and death for others. Harold sighed, shaking his head. You boys need to learn something about respect, he said. That man's forgotten more about courage than you'll ever know. No one laughed again. And outside, the faint wail of a siren began to rise in the distance. A sound none of them noticed yet, but one that would soon change everything. The siren outside faded as quickly as it came, swallowed by the slow rhythm of life in the small Montana town. The laughter that had filled the gun store earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet that clung to the air like dust. Jake Turner stood behind the counter, staring at the receipt still lying there. Major Walter Ahn, U.S. Army. Ret. The name sat on the page like a scar. Harold, the store owner, had already gone back to his office, muttering something about respect and history. The 3 young men who had mocked Walter earlier now shuffled awkwardly, unsure whether to leave or pretend nothing had happened. Jake tried to shake off the strange weight in his chest. Man, It's not like we meant anything by it, he muttered, half to himself. We were just joking around. The others didn't reply. Through the front window, they could still see the old man's silhouette, shrinking down the sunlit street. He walked slowly but straight, like someone who didn't care what the world thought of him anymore. Outside, Walter moved with quiet purpose. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried that same distant focus, the look of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. The Colt 1911 was wrapped neatly in brown paper under his arm, a familiar weight that somehow felt heavier with each step. He passed by the diner, where the smell of frying bacon and coffee lingered in the air, and where a few old-timers sat by the window. One of them looked up, squinting. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said softly. "Is that Walter N?" "Thought he moved out years ago," another replied. Walter gave them a nod as he walked by, but didn't stop. He didn't need to. He'd been away for years, decades even, but nothing in this town had really changed. The same cracked sidewalks, the same tired storefronts, the same people pretending time wasn't catching up to them. For him, this place was both comfort and ghost. Back in the gun store, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. "Hey, you think that story Harold told was true?" he asked his friends. "About him saving people in the war?" One of them shrugged. "Could be. But you know how old folks are. People exaggerate." "Not Harold," Jake said quietly. He looked scared when he said that name. The others exchanged glances, but said nothing more. The laughter that had come so easily before now felt impossible to recall. It was strange, Jake thought, how quickly the mood could change, how someone could walk in and without saying much, alter the entire feel of a place. He looked down at the receipt again. The ink from Walter's signature hadn't even dried yet, but already it felt like a piece of history. Outside, the sun slipped lower. The air grew cooler. Walter reached the edge of Main Street and stopped in front of a small park. There was a bench under a maple tree, one that hadn't been there before he left town years ago. He sat down slowly, resting the wrapped pistol beside him. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was creased from years of being folded and unfolded. The picture showed a group of young men in uniform, smiling, arms slung around each other's shoulders. In the center stood Walter, younger, stronger, eyes sharp with purpose. He ran his thumb over one of the faces, pausing at a name written in faded ink on the back. Tommy Raines, 1971. He exhaled slowly. 50 years hadn't dulled the ache of certain memories. He could still hear the jungle sounds, still smell the gunpowder, still remember the moment Tommy was gone. He had promised himself long ago he would never pick up a weapon again. But promises, like memories, sometimes broke quietly under the weight of time. Back in the store, Jake tried to distract himself by reorganizing the shelf behind the counter. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder with every second. The store felt empty even though it wasn't. Then, out of nowhere, the door opened again, the bell chiming sharply in the silence. Everyone jumped a little. But it wasn't Walter. It was a man in his 40s, wearing a deputy's badge. "Harold around?" he asked. Jake nodded and called toward the back. Harold emerged, wiping his hands. The deputy tipped his hat. "Afternoon. Just letting folks know we've had some sketchy reports. Couple fellas were seen near the bank earlier, acting strange. You might want to keep an eye out. Don't want anyone getting hurt." Harold frowned. "You think there's trouble coming?" "Could be nothing," the deputy replied. "But we're staying alert. Folks these days do desperate things." As the deputy left, Jake felt a small chill run through him. He turned to his friends. "Weird, huh? Maybe the old guy had a point wanting that gun." They laughed weakly, but no one found it funny. Meanwhile, Walter sat on the park bench, staring at the photograph one last time before tucking it away. The town's quiet hum surrounded him, the distant chatter from the diner, the soft rumble of a truck on the highway, the creak of the flagpole's rope swaying in the breeze. Peaceful, almost too peaceful. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Somewhere down the street, he heard shouting. Not the kind of shouting that came from arguments, but the sharp, panicked kind that always came before chaos. A car door slammed. Then another. He stood, slow but deliberate, and began walking back toward the gun store. Back there, Jake and the others heard it too, the faint noise of commotion, muffled through the walls. Harold peeked through the window and frowned. "Something's happening near the bank," he said. Jake leaned beside him and caught sight of two masked men running across the street, one of them holding a duffel bag, the other waving a gun. "Holy!" Jake didn't finish his sentence. The robbers darted into the small bank across the road, shoving a man aside as they disappeared inside. People screamed. Someone shouted to call the sheriff. Harold stepped back from the window. "Get down," he hissed. But Jake stayed near the glass, frozen in place. The scene didn't feel real. It was like watching a movie, only this one was happening 30 feet away. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw him again. Walter N. The old man was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, just across from the bank, calm as a statue. The brown paper package was gone, replaced by the glint of steel in his hand. For a moment, Jake couldn't move. He wanted to shout something, to warn him, to stop him, but the words caught in his throat. Walter didn't seem to notice the chaos. His eyes locked on the bank doors with that same steady focus Jake had seen earlier when he held the yell. Colt. There was no hesitation in his movements, only calm. "Is that him?" one of Jake's friends whispered from behind the counter. Jake nodded slowly, unable to look away. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's him." Across the street, the bank door flew open, and one of the robbers stepped out, gun raised. The screams grew louder. People dove for cover behind cars and mailboxes. But Walter didn't move. He just stood there, the light glinting off his gray hair and the barrel of his Colt. The clock inside the gun store ticked once, then twice, and then everything changed. The street was no longer quiet. Shouts and hurried footsteps echoed off the storefronts as the townspeople scattered for safety. Someone slammed the diner door shut. A child began crying somewhere down the block. The stillness that had defined that afternoon was gone, replaced by a pulse of panic that ran through the town like a heartbeat gone wrong. Inside the gun store, Jake crouched behind the counter, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do we do?" he hissed. Harold, the store owner, peered through the blinds with narrowed eyes. "Stay down," he whispered. "Let the sheriff handle it." But Jake couldn't keep still. Through the slits in the blinds, he saw the two masked men pacing outside the bank. One of them was shouting orders at a trembling teller. The other waved a pistol in the air, threatening invisible enemies. And then he saw him. Walter Ahn stood motionless in the middle of the street. His shoulders were squared, his coat fluttering lightly in the wind. To Jake, the old man seemed out of place, too calm, too composed, like he belonged to a different world entirely. The robber nearest the door yelled something at him, a warning. Walter didn't move. He stood there as if listening to an echo only he could hear. The chaos around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by something else, memory. 50 years earlier, the sound of shouting wasn't from a small town street, but from a jungle clearing halfway across the world. The air there had been thick and heavy, filled with the scent of rain and smoke. Walter, much younger then, had crouched behind a fallen log, listening to the call of his unit through the static of a radio. He remembered the fear, not his own, but that of the younger soldiers who looked to him for direction. "Major, what do we do?" He had answered them calmly, the same calm that filled him now. "Breathe. Keep your head. Wait for the right moment." He hadn't fired then out of anger, but out of protection. Every action had meaning. Every decision carried the weight of lives. Back in the present, that same composure was etched into every line of Walter's face. The sheriff's car screeched to a stop at the corner, lights flashing red and blue. Officers shouted commands through megaphones. The robbers yelled back, panicked, trapped. The tension thickened until it was almost unbearable. Jake pressed his forehead to the counter. "Why isn't he moving?" He whispered. "Why is he just standing there?" Harold didn't answer. His gaze stayed locked on the old man. "Because he's thinking," he murmured. "That's what soldiers do. They think before they act." The deputy took up position behind his patrol car, shouting for the robbers to surrender. But the younger of the two robbers was too frightened to listen. He paced near the door, waving his pistol wildly. Fear had taken over. Walter could see it in his posture, in the way his hands shook. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a boy who'd lost his way. He called out softly, his voice cutting through the chaos like the edge of calm water. "Son, it's not worth it. Put it down." Jake's breath caught. The sound of the old man's voice was strangely steady, not loud, but firm enough to be heard across the street. For a moment, everything froze. Even the robber hesitated. Walter took a slow step forward. "No one has to get hurt," he said. "You've got choices left." The older robber snapped something sharp in reply, but his partner hesitated again. He looked lost, not just in the situation, but in his own life. And for the briefest second, Walter's expression softened. He had seen this before, not just once, but many times. Men too young to understand the weight of what they carried. Behind him, a light breeze stirred the dust across the street. The flags on the bank's porch fluttered weakly. The world held its breath. Then came a single, piercing sound, not of violence, but of surrender. The younger robber dropped his weapon first, his voice breaking. "I can't do this," he shouted. "I didn't sign up for this." His partner cursed, frustrated, panicked. Police officers rushed forward, voices overlapping. In seconds, a chaos that had seemed endless began to unravel. Walter didn't move until the sheriff himself called out, "It's over." Only then did he exhale, a quiet, weary breath that carried half a lifetime's worth of weight. Inside the gun store, no one spoke for several long moments. The silence was heavy, almost sacred. Jake finally rose from behind the counter and walked to the window. The street outside looked like a painting frozen mid-motion. The sheriff speaking with his men, the two robbers being led away, the old man standing quietly in the center of it all. "Is he okay?" Jake asked. Harold nodded slowly. "He's fine," he said. "He's always fine. That's the kind of man he is." The young men exchanged glances, the earlier arrogance gone completely. What they saw outside wasn't a frail old veteran or a man past his prime. It was something else, a reminder that courage doesn't come from youth or strength, but from composure, from knowing when not to run. Jake opened the store door and stepped outside, the bell jingling faintly. The cool air hit his face as he crossed the sidewalk. The sheriff and his deputies were busy, but Walter stood apart from them, staring down the empty street where the echoes of chaos still lingered. Jake hesitated before speaking. "Sir, are you all right?" Walter turned slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm fine, son," he said. "Just a bit older than I was the last time I saw something like that." Jake swallowed hard. You were amazing out there. I mean, the way you handled it." Walter shook his head. "I didn't handle anything. Those boys made their choice." He looked toward the patrol car where the robbers sat, heads bowed. "I just reminded them they still had one." Jake nodded, unsure what to say. The sheriff approached then, his face a mixture of relief and admiration. "Major N," he said respectfully, "you saved a lot of people today." Walter's eyes drifted to the ground. "I didn't save anyone," he murmured. "Just stopped another mistake before it got worse." The sheriff started to reply, but stopped when he saw the expression on Walter's face, the kind that said the conversation was over. Walter adjusted his coat, turned toward the gun store, and walked slowly back across the street. The people who had gathered to watch parted silently as he passed. No one spoke. No one dared to. Jake followed him back inside, unsure if he should say anything. The smell of gun oil and old wood filled the room again. The same store that had been full of laughter an hour ago now felt like a chapel. Walter stopped by the counter, placed the Colt gently on it, and said, "Keep it safe for me, would you? I think I'm done carrying for today." Jake nodded quickly, still speechless. The old man smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of understanding. "You see, son," he said quietly, "you don't earn respect by talking loud or looking strong. You earn it by knowing when not to pull the trigger, in life and in anger." And with that, Walter Ain walked out of the store once more. The bell jingled. The wind followed him. And for a long time after, no one inside spoke a single word. The next morning, the town of Millstone woke under a strange, uneasy silence. The usual sounds of life, the clanging of the diner's breakfast plates, the chatter of morning customers, the distant hum of tractors, felt quieter, as though the town itself was still processing what had happened the day before. News had spread fast. In small towns, it always did. By dawn, everyone from the postmaster to the high school janitor had heard the same story, each version slightly more dramatic than the last. An old man stopped a robbery at the bank. He stared down two armed men. He didn't even blink. And yet, the one thing no one seemed to know for sure was who, exactly, Walter Ain really was. At the corner cafe, a cluster of locals gathered over steaming cups of coffee. "You think he's ex-military?" one asked. "Has to be," another replied. "No man stands like that unless he's seen things." "But he's been here for years," said a woman in a floral dress. "Always quiet, polite, pays in cash." "You'd never think." Their voices trailed off when Walter himself walked past the window. He moved slowly, his posture dignified but humble. The brim of his old hat shaded his eyes, and his coat hung neatly on his frame. To the townsfolk, he suddenly seemed taller, heavier with presence. No one waved. No one dared to. At the gun store, Jake and Harold were sweeping the floor, though there wasn't much to clean. The bell above the door still jingled every time someone came in, but now each visitor spoke in hushed tones, like they were entering a church. Jake had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment when Walter stood in the street, the stillness, the calm, the authority that had silenced chaos itself. When the bell rang, he almost jumped. "Morning, Jake," came Walter's familiar voice. Jake straightened up quickly. "Mr. N, sir." "Good morning." Walter gave a small nod, glancing around the store. "Didn't expect to see so many visitors so early," he said, noticing the small crowd peeking in from outside. Harold stepped forward, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Seems folks finally realized what kind of man you are, Walter." Walter's expression didn't change. "I'm no different than yesterday, Harold," he said quietly. "They just see a story now." Harold smiled faintly. "Well, Stories are how towns remember their heroes. Walter chuckled softly. Heroes? I've seen real ones, Harold. They don't usually walk home after. Jake looked down, his chest tightening with something like guilt. He remembered how he and his friends had laughed when Walter first entered the store, calling him the relic and joking about his slow gait. Now, those same words burned like embers in his memory. Later that afternoon, the sheriff dropped by the store, tipping his hat as he entered. Afternoon, gentlemen? Harold nodded. Afternoon, Sheriff. How's the situation? Wrapped up, the sheriff said, glancing toward Walter. The young one confessed. Said your words stopped him cold. Walter didn't reply. The sheriff hesitated before continuing. You know, I looked up your record last night. Didn't mean to pry, but when a man does what you did, folks get curious. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. Walter N. Major, United States Army. 2 tours overseas. Awarded the Silver Star. The paper rested between them like a confession. Jake blinked, unable to process what he was hearing. Harold exhaled slowly. I knew you'd served, but I didn't realize. Walter raised a hand. That was a lifetime ago, he said softly. Another world. The sheriff nodded respectfully. Still, Millstone ought to know who's living among them. Walter's tone was firm. No, let them remember the lesson, not the man. There was silence after that, the kind that demanded respect. The sheriff finally tipped his hat and said, Fair enough, Major, but for what it's worth, this town owes you. After he left, Jake stood there quietly, the words Major N echoing in his mind. He looked at Walter with newfound awe. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Walter smiled faintly. Because medals don't make you a good man, son. What you do after the war, that's what defines you. That evening, the sun dipped low over the fields, painting the town in shades of gold and quiet. Walter sat on the porch of his small farmhouse at the edge of town, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hands. The radio played softly, an old jazz tune, faint and comforting. He watched the light fade, his thoughts drifting like clouds over old memories. He didn't think of the robbery, nor the noise of sirens. He thought of his men, the ones who hadn't come home. He thought of the promises made long ago, of peace that always seemed to arrive too late. There was a knock at the gate. Jake stood there, hesitant but determined. Sir, he said, I brought something. He held out a small wooden box, the same Colt revolver Walter had left at the store. Walter shook his head. You can keep it, Jake. I can't, Jake said quickly. It's not mine. And besides? He hesitated. I don't think I need it anymore. Walter's eyes softened. That's good, he said. Means you learned something. Jake stepped closer. I did. I learned that strength isn't about what you carry. It's about what you can put down. For a moment, Walter said nothing. Then he smiled, a real quiet smile that reached his eyes. You're wiser than most men twice your age, he said. Don't lose that. Jake looked out toward the sunset. Everyone's talking about you. You know. The sheriff, the paper, even Mrs. Wilkins at the diner. Walter chuckled. Let them talk. Stories fade faster than sunsets. Jake smiled. Maybe, but some stories deserve to last. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then said, If they do, make sure they remember what mattered. Not the man, but the moment. The choice. Jake nodded slowly. Yes, sir. As the sky deepened into twilight, the two of them sat in silence. The breeze rustled through the wheat, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. In that stillness, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that respect, once earned, didn't need to be declared. It simply was. By nightfall, The story of the old man who stopped the robbery had already taken on the weight of legend. Children whispered it as they walked home from school. Old men at the barber shop retold it with new flourishes. But in every version, one thing remained the same. When the old man had spoken, the world had gone quiet. They said it wasn't fear that silenced the crowd. It was reverence. And though Walter never asked for it, he carried that silence with him, like a medal far heavier than the ones he'd ever worn on his chest. 3 days had passed since the robbery, but Millstone still hummed with the energy of that single, unforgettable hour. For most small towns, a story like that would fade within days, replaced by talk of weather, crops, or high school football. But this one stuck. It had depth. It had mystery. And mystery was something Emily Carter couldn't resist. Emily was the town's only journalist, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s who worked for the Millstone Gazette, a paper that hadn't broken a major story in decades. She'd heard the rumors like everyone else, but while others saw a hero, she saw a question. Who exactly was Walter Hahn? Her curiosity wasn't driven by gossip or glory. It was professional instinct. Heroes in her experience were rarely as simple as they seemed. So on a quiet Thursday morning, she walked up the gravel road that led to Walter's farmhouse, notebook in hand. The October sun filtered through thinning trees, painting long golden lines across the dirt path. Walter was already outside, stacking firewood with calm precision. "Morning," Emily called out. Walter turned, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Morning, Miss Carter. You here for a story, I suppose?" She smiled politely. "You heard right. The whole town's talking, Mr. N. I thought maybe it was time to hear it from you." Walter chuckled softly. "Afraid I don't have much to say that folks haven't already made up." Emily flipped open her notebook. "Maybe not, but there's a difference between stories and truth." For a moment, Walter studied her, not unkindly, but with the wary look of someone who had spent years avoiding questions. Then he gestured toward the porch. "Well, the truth's a tricky thing. Come sit, then." They sat across from each other, a pot of coffee between them. The wind tugged gently at the porch curtains. "So," Emily began, "you served in the army?" Walter nodded once. "Long time ago? 2 tours?" "3, he corrected quietly. Emily jotted a note, then asked, "And you never told anyone?" "No need to," he replied. "War's not something you hang on the wall like a diploma." She hesitated, sensing the edge in his tone. "The sheriff said you earned the Silver Star." Walter looked past her toward the fields. "They gave a lot of those out. Some to men who deserved better. Some to men who didn't come home to get theirs." Emily felt the weight of his words settle between them. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the porch boards. Then she asked the question she'd been holding back. "What happened over there, Mr. N?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the wheat met the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, not broken, but heavy with memory. "I commanded a small unit. Good men, young, brave, too brave sometimes." He paused. "We were ambushed in the jungle. Half my men didn't make it. The rest, I got them home. But I've never stopped hearing the ones I didn't." Emily lowered her pen. There was something sacred in his tone, something that didn't belong on newsprint. After a long silence, Walter stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "That's all there is to tell," he said. "The rest belongs to ghosts." Emily rose too, unsure what to say. "Thank you, Mr. N, for your time." He nodded politely. "Safe walk home, Miss Carter." Back at her small office above the diner, Emily stared at the half-written story glowing on her computer screen. Local veteran stops robbery. Town hails him as a hero. It was factual, yes, But it didn't capture the man she'd met, a man haunted by silence, not powered by pride. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. So she dug deeper. That night, she searched military archives, cross-referenced names, and called an old contact from a state veterans association. When she finally found the record, her breath caught. Major Walter Ahn, 3rd Battalion, 17th Infantry. Operation Fireleaf, classified for 40 years. Most files were redacted, but one declassified report caught her eye. It was a letter written by a sergeant under Ang command. The final line made her stop cold. If not for Major Ahn, none of us would have made it out alive. He carried us through the storm, even when command had given up. Emily sat back, stunned. The letter was dated months after the battle, written from a hospital. It wasn't just a note of respect. It was testimony. She looked again at the man's name, Sergeant Paul O'Reilly. That name matched the sheriff's late father. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. The next morning, Emily walked into the sheriff's office, holding a printed copy of the letter. He looked up from his desk, surprised. "Morning, Emily. You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," she said, placing the paper down in front of him. "Did you know your father served under Major N?" The sheriff blinked, taken aback. "My dad? No, he never mentioned it. He barely talked about the war at all." Emily pointed to the letter. "He wrote this." The sheriff read silently. His eyes softened. That's him, all right." He set the paper down carefully. "So N wasn't just some soldier. He saved my father's life." Emily nodded. "And maybe a lot more than that." For a while, neither of them spoke. Then the sheriff said quietly, "He never told anyone because he didn't want the thanks. He carried that alone." Emily's voice softened. "Maybe it's time someone told it for him." That afternoon, the Gazette printed its biggest headline in years. "The man who saved Millstone twice. The untold story of Major Walter Ahn, the quiet hero among us." The article spread like wildfire. But unlike most news, this one didn't fade. It ignited something. At the diner, people read it aloud between bites of pie. At the school, teachers pinned it to bulletin boards. Even the Veterans Hall in the next county called to ask for copies. When Walter walked through town that evening, people stopped what they were doing. No one clapped or cheered. They simply nodded, slow, silent, and full of respect. He didn't say much, only lifted his hat politely and kept walking. But inside, something shifted. For the first time in a long while, the memories didn't feel like a burden. They felt like history, finally seen, finally understood. That night, he sat by his window, reading the article under the soft glow of a single lamp. His hand trembled slightly as he traced the words of O'Reilly's letter. He whispered, "You didn't have to do that, Paul." Outside, the wind rustled the wheat. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. For the first time in decades, Walter smiled not out of politeness, but out of peace. For days after the Gazette article, Millstone felt different, warmer somehow, like the town had rediscovered a piece of itself it never knew was missing. Wherever Walter Hahn went, heads turned. Not out of curiosity, no, but out of quiet respect. The old veteran who had once passed unnoticed was suddenly the center of attention. The mayor himself, a round, cheerful man named Douglas Weller, showed up at Walter's doorstep one bright morning with a broad smile and a handshake. "Major N," he said, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "You, sir, are the pride of Millstone. The councils voted unanimously to honor you at next week's Founders' Day ceremony." Walter blinked, caught off guard. "Honor me? For what?" "For your heroism, both in uniform and right here at home," Weller replied, nearly bouncing with excitement. A newspaper story brought us all together. We'll be presenting you with the town's Medal of Service. It's long overdue, don't you think? Walter managed a polite smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I appreciate the thought, Mr. Mayor, but, oh no buts. Weller interrupted cheerfully. You don't get a say in this one. The people need something to believe in, and you, Major, are it. Before Walter could protest, the mayor clapped him on the shoulder and left, still talking about banners and speeches. The sound of his car faded down the road, leaving the old man standing alone on his porch, staring at the quiet fields stretching toward the horizon. That evening, Jake stopped by again. Everyone's talking about the ceremony, he said, setting a bag of groceries on the porch table. They're even setting up a stage in the square. You'll be sitting next to the mayor and the sheriff. Walter sighed softly. I'd rather be sitting right here. Jake frowned. You don't want to go? I don't belong on a stage, Walter replied. That's for men who are proud of what they did. I did what I had to. Jake leaned forward, his tone gentle. But sir, you saved lives. Twice. Isn't that something worth standing for? Walter looked down at his weathered hands. You know what happens when people start calling someone a hero? They forget that he's human. They turn him into a symbol. And symbols don't bleed, don't break, don't wake up at 3 a.m. hearing things that aren't there. Jake hesitated. You still hear it? After all these years? Walter gave a faint, sad smile. Every night. The young man didn't know what to say. He wanted to argue, to insist that Walter deserved the praise, but there was something in the old man's eyes that stopped him. A kind of weariness that came not from age, but from remembering too much. 2 days later, Emily Carter came to visit. She found Walter sitting on the same porch, polishing an old photo frame. Inside it was a faded picture, a group of young soldiers in jungle fatigues, smiling at the camera. I should have asked before writing that story, she said quietly. I didn't mean to stir up all this attention. Walter shook his head. You wrote what you thought was right. I can't fault you for that. But it's bothering you, she pressed gently. Isn't it? He nodded. It's not that I don't appreciate it. It's just, praise can feel heavier than guilt sometimes. When they look at me, they don't see the men who didn't come home. They see the one who did. Emily sat beside him. Maybe they see the one who carried their memory with him, who never let it be forgotten. Walter was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, You remind me of someone. There was a medic in my unit, young, curious, always asking questions. He said once that the hardest part of surviving isn't living through the war. It's learning how to live after it. Emily's eyes softened. Maybe that's what this is, a way to help you live after it. Walter looked at her, then at the photograph. Or maybe it's a way to bury it deeper, he murmured. When Founders Day arrived, the town square was dressed like never before. Flags lined the lampposts, ribbons fluttered in the wind, and the air buzzed with excitement. Children darted between tables of pies and lemonade. A small band tuned their instruments near the stage. Jake stood among the crowd, scanning the area anxiously. You think he'll show? He asked Emily, who was standing nearby with her camera. She shrugged. I honestly don't know. At 11 a.m., the mayor took the stage, his voice booming through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a man who represents the very best of Millstone, courage, humility, and heart. Please welcome Major Walter N. The crowd erupted in applause. But as the seconds ticked by, no one appeared. Murmurs spread. Children stopped clapping. The mayor looked toward the sheriff in confusion. And then, quietly, from the back of the square, Walter emerged. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just his simple coat and hat. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, until he reached the stage. The mayor extended his hand, but Walter simply nodded, stepping up to the microphone. The crowd hushed instantly. He looked out at them, the people of Millstone, the faces that had once dismissed him, now filled with admiration. "I appreciate what you've done," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But before anyone calls me a hero, I need to say something." The air seemed to tighten. "I didn't save this town because I'm brave. I did what anyone should have done. I reminded two lost boys that they still had a choice. That's all. As for the war," he paused, glancing down briefly, "there's no glory in it. Only lessons, ones I learned too late." The mayor shifted uncomfortably, but Walter continued. "If you want to honor me, don't do it with medals or banners. Do it by helping the ones who come home carrying invisible wounds. They're the real battles no one talks about." He looked directly at the sheriff then, and added softly, "And thank you for letting me live quietly here. That's the greatest gift I've ever had." For a moment, the crowd was utterly still. Then, slowly, quietly, the applause began. It wasn't loud or wild. It was soft, steady, sincere. Walter nodded once, stepped down from the stage, and made his way through the crowd. People reached out to shake his hand, but he only smiled politely, refusing to let the moment become about spectacle. When he reached Jake and Emily, he gave a small smile. "You both look like you've seen a ghost." Emily laughed through tears. "More like we just met one." Jake grinned. "You know, sir, you really don't make it easy for people to forget you." Walter chuckled. "Good. Maybe they'll remember the right things this time." As he walked away, the band began to play a soft, slow tune. Not a march, but a lullaby. It drifted across the square like a prayer, rising over the noise of life returning to normal. And for the first time in years, Walter Ahn didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man who'd finally made peace with it. Winter had begun to creep into Millstone, wrapping the small town in its quiet, gray fingers. Snow dusted the rooftops and coated the fields in soft white. The same streets that had once been alive with the chatter of Founder's Day now felt hushed, as though the earth itself had paused to catch its breath. Walter Ahn moved more slowly these days. His once steady hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee cup in the mornings. The daily walks through the fields that had kept him connected to the world now left him short of breath. Even so, he refused to complain. Jake noticed it first. He had stopped by the store one morning to drop off a box of groceries and saw Walter leaning against the porch railing, squinting through the cold wind. "Sir," Jake said gently, "maybe you should sit down. You've been out here a long time." Walter shook his head. "Just taking in the morning, son. The world's quiet right now, and I like it that way." Jake frowned, unease creeping up his chest. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know." Walter's eyes softened. "Maybe not, Jake, but some things are meant to be carried alone." Still, when the young man left, Jake felt a weight settle in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet, patient man who had once stared down danger in the street was now facing another kind of battle, one that none of his medals could shield him from. Across town, Emily Carter had been following the story quietly, writing articles about veterans, community service, and the human spirit. But lately, she sensed a shift. The piece she had written about Walter's heroism was still being talked about, but now it was tinged with concern. "People are noticing he's not as strong as he was," she said one afternoon to the sheriff. They were standing near the park where Walter had once stopped the robbery. The sheriff nodded slowly. "He's 78, Emily. Time doesn't slow down for anyone. But it's more than that. He's carrying the weight of decades. Some wounds never heal." Emily glanced toward the street, where a few children played in the snow, their laughter echoing faintly. "Maybe it's time the town gives back. He gave so much, and we never really did anything, not until the ceremony. But we can do more. The sheriff's eyes softened. You're right. And I think it's time he knows it. That evening, a meeting was held at the town hall. The mayor, the sheriff, Jake, Emily, and a few council members gathered in a circle of folding chairs. Plans were discussed quietly and seriously. We can't stop the seasons, but we can honor him while he's here to see it, the mayor said, his voice measured. A community day. Not just medals, stories, memories, and faces of the people he saved or inspired. Emily spoke next. We can collect letters, photos, memories from anyone who knows him, or anyone who has been touched by what he's done. We can make a book. Something lasting. Jake added, and we can take care of him. Make sure he's warm, has enough to eat, doesn't overdo himself. Small things, but they mean a lot. Walter was not consulted. The meeting was about him, but in true Anne fashion, he remained unaware, sitting quietly in his home, watching the smoke rise from his chimney. The first snow of the season arrived late that night, falling silently over Millstone. Walter sat by the window, a cup of tea warming his hands. Outside, the world was white and calm. He felt a quiet melancholy, a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The town had celebrated him, yet he felt the pull of memory more acutely now. The young soldiers who hadn't returned, the faces of men and boys he couldn't forget. Each memory was a shadow, stretching long and cold across the floors of his mind. He whispered softly to himself, as he often did, "It's not for me." It never was. Over the next week, the townspeople quietly mobilized. Letters and photos were delivered to Walter's home. Jake and a few neighbors cleared paths through the snow. Emily continued documenting his life, but she also began collecting stories from other veterans in the area. Each account was a thread, weaving a tapestry of memory that honored Walter not for his medals, but for the lives he touched. On a crisp Sunday morning, the town organized a small gathering outside Walter's farmhouse. Children held handmade signs. "Thank you, Mr. An, and our hero, our neighbor." The sheriff brought hot cider and blankets for everyone. Even the mayor showed up, his cheeks red from the cold, grinning like a boy at a holiday parade. Walter appeared at the door slowly, leaning on his cane. He looked out at the small crowd, his heart tightening with something he hadn't felt in decades, belonging. Jake stepped forward and offered his arm. "Sir, we want you to join us." Walter hesitated, then nodded. With careful, deliberate steps, he moved toward the gathering. Every face was turned toward him. Some smiled. Some simply watched quietly, unsure how to approach a man who had once seemed untouchable. Emily raised her camera, but instead of clicking, she lowered it. She realized the moment wasn't for pictures. It was for remembrance. The ceremony began with soft music, a slow, steady tune that drifted through the crisp air. People stepped forward, reading letters aloud. Veterans spoke of his calm leadership. Neighbors recounted his small acts of kindness. Children recited poems they had written. Walter listened quietly, eyes misting at times. His stoic exterior remained mostly intact, but every word, every memory shared, seemed to lighten the weight he carried. When it was Jake's turn, he approached slowly. "Sir," he said, holding a small wooden box, "we wanted you to have this. Not because you need it, but because you've shown us what true courage is." Walter opened it to reveal a simple pendant etched with the words, "Courage in silence." He looked up, meeting the young man's eyes. "You've done more than you know, Jake." The crowd applauded softly, but the focus remained on the old veteran. For the first time, he allowed himself to accept gratitude without guilt. As night fell, the townspeople lingered, leaving gifts, food, and letters on the porch. Walter returned inside, shutting the door gently behind him. He sat by the fire, looking at the pendant in his hand. His mind wandered back to the jungles, the battles, the men who never came home. But this time, the shadows felt less oppressive. The faces of Millstone, smiling and sincere, surrounded him in memory and presence alike. He whispered softly, "Perhaps this is what peace feels like." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Snow glimmered under the moonlight, blanketing Millstone in a quiet serenity. For the first time in a long while, Walter didn't feel alone. He was surrounded not just by neighbors and townspeople, but by a living testament to the choices he had made, the lives he had saved, the lessons he had passed on, and the courage he had quietly carried all those years. Spring approached Millstone slowly, stretching its fingers across the town in tender greens and soft blooms. The streets shimmered with sunlight, and the river glinted like liquid glass. Life, in its endless rhythm, seemed almost oblivious to the man who had become a living legend within it. Walter, however, was acutely aware of the passing seasons. The walks through the fields were shorter now, the stairs in his house steeper. Each breath carried the echo of decades, both quiet and tumultuous. Jake noticed the change immediately. One morning, he came by with a basket of supplies and found Walter sitting by the window, staring at the horizon. "Sir," Jake said gently, "maybe you should rest today. It's warmer inside." Walter shook his head faintly. "Rest is not what keeps me alive, son. Reflection is." He turned toward the fading sunlight. "I keep thinking about the paths I took, and the ones I didn't." Jake nodded, unsure what to say. There was a weight in the old man's voice that had nothing to do with age. The town had continued to honor him quietly. Letters and visits hadn't stopped, and Emily Carter had finished compiling a book of stories about Walter's life, not just the heroic moments, but the small kindnesses, the quiet leadership, and the decades of courage that had gone unnoticed. Emily had insisted he read the manuscript. Walter had flipped through it once, his hands trembling slightly as he saw the stories of people he had touched. Neighbors, children, veterans, even strangers he had never met. "Too many people think a life is measured by medals or achievements," he had said softly. "But this shows the quiet ones, the choices that matter." Emily smiled. "You taught them all, even without trying." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, yet there was a shadow in his eyes. One afternoon, Walter felt a sharp ache in his chest as he stood in the kitchen. He sat down slowly, breathing heavily. The room felt warmer, brighter, yet somehow smaller, as though time itself was reminding him that he was mortal. Jake, who had been checking on him, rushed to his side. "Sir, what's wrong?" "I'm fine, son," Walter replied, though his voice was strained. "Just thinking." Jake refused to leave, sitting beside him as the old man rested. Silence passed between them, unbroken and respectful. In that quiet, Jake understood something profound. Walter had always faced battles, both seen and unseen, and now he faced the one that awaited all men, the final chapter. As evening fell, the town square was quiet. Children had gone home, and the sunlight faded into a warm orange glow. But word had spread. Walter, the quiet hero, was unwell. People gathered near his home, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. The mayor, the sheriff, Emily, and Jake all arrived with blankets, food, and flowers. Their presence wasn't an intrusion. It was a vigil of gratitude. Walter looked at them, his eyes soft but steady. "Thank you," he whispered. "All of you, for seeing what matters, and for reminding me that the story isn't mine alone." Emily held up the book she had finished. "Sir, this is for you, the town stories all collected. You don't have to carry them alone anymore." He nodded, a single tear escaping the corner of his eye. "It's enough." more than I ever hoped for. That night, Walter sat by his fireplace, the book open on his lap. His mind wandered, tracing back decades of memories, the jungles, the young men who had followed him, the choices he had made, and the quiet heroism that had defined his life. He remembered the day he had entered the gun store, the laughter of young men dismissing him, and the silence that had fallen after his calm command. That silence had become a constant companion, sometimes heavy, sometimes comforting. He whispered softly to himself, "I've done what I could. I've tried to leave the world a little better than I found it." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of spring flowers and the promise of renewal. Walter closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, each one a silent testament to a life lived with courage, humility, and quiet purpose. The next morning, Jake arrived at the porch to find the house empty. At first, panic rose in his chest, but then he noticed the chair near the fireplace, Walter's blanket neatly folded over the back, the book resting open. Emily arrived moments later, carrying the final copy of her compiled stories. She knelt beside Jake, her voice trembling. "He's gone," she whispered. The town gathered quietly as news spread. No sirens, no chaos, just an overwhelming hush. Millstone, which had laughed at the old man entering the gun store months ago, now stood in reverent silence. At the church, at the hall, in homes and fields, people shared memories, whispered stories, and honored the man who had taught them more than they could have known. The mayor spoke softly at a gathering in the square. Walter Ahn didn't ask for medals. He didn't demand recognition. He showed us that courage isn't loud or flashy. It's steady, quiet, and sometimes invisible. Today, we remember him as he lived, with integrity, humility, and a heart wide enough to carry us all. Jake placed the wooden pendant, Courage in Silence, on the town memorial. Emily read excerpts from her book aloud, recounting tales of Walter's kindness, bravery, and quiet leadership. Children listened, wide-eyed. Veterans nodded. Neighbors, friends, and strangers alike bowed their heads. For hours, the town remained united in remembrance. And though Walter was gone, his presence lingered in every story, every smile, every whispered lesson about courage, humility, and the power of choice. Weeks later, the gun store reopened after minor repairs, and Jake kept Walter's favorite chair by the window. The town continued its life, simple, quiet, yet enriched by the legacy of one man who had walked among them and left an indelible mark. Visitors would often ask Jake about the old man who had stopped the robbery. He would smile softly and say, "He wasn't just an old man. He was the kind of person who reminded us that silence can speak louder than words, and that a single choice can change everything." And somewhere beyond the fields, where the wind brushed through the wheat and the river shimmered in sunlight, Walter Ahn quiet courage echoed, a timeless, invisible force that the town would carry forever.